And you can start.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to the Housing Retention Model Workshop on behalf of Scampin Enterprise. We are so delighted to have you with us today. Thanks for joining us. I know you got a lot of choices with your time. This is kind of the second session, if you will, in a longer kind of series we're doing with SCAMP with respect to resident services and affordable and supportive housing. So this is kind of an ongoing theme. And this, for me, you might have recalled back in February, we had a chance to do like an introductory session for resident services. So hopefully this kind of builds off of that for those that were able to join back in February. But my name is Mark Tusignan. I'm a director in our vulnerable populations team with the Enterprise Southern California office. And just want to thank Jeanette Brown and really the whole SCAMP team for really helping us put this together today, and certainly our presenters. This is now a tremendous way to stay engaged while we're all generally working still remotely, and just to keep that sort of knowledge sharing and sort of professional development, those opportunities going. And if anything, we've almost accelerated that. We've all been kind of working remotely. So it's been exciting to kind of continue these sessions. So today's going to focus on housing retention. This is sort of where the support and supportive housing really kicks in. Again, the focus is on how we can promote housing stability. So we're going to hear from two supportive housing practitioners who have developed some techniques and insights over time around how that plays out in terms of achieving that outcome. First, we're going to hear from Maria Brown, who's the director of permanent housing with Path Ventures. A lot of you are familiar with Path Ventures. They're one of the premier supportive housing providers, not only in the LA area, but certainly in the region, more broadly and statewide. And had a long history with Maria. She's fantastic, one of the sharpest practitioners we have in the area. And we're going to walk through kind of an innovative 4-step model around housing retention that really gets into not only the philosophy behind that relationship with residents and sort of as owners and service providers and property management representatives, but really getting into some of those specific techniques and the tool around how we really achieve that. So this has been so successful in achieving that outcome that it's been, I believe it's been trademarked. So a very, very effective tool at doing that. Then we're going to turn to the folks at Century Housing. So we have Kimberly Wee and Brett Morales to walk through kind of how this model is being adapted and implemented at Century Villages at Cabrillo, which is a major program. I know we'll hear a little bit about that program in Long Beach. And from there, we will have some time for questions and answers. So feel free to use the chat feature as well to sort of communicate with us around questions you have. We will leave some time at the end. And certainly presenters, feel free to navigate, any questions you want to deal with in real time. But I think generally with an hour, we have a lot to get to. So we want to kind of park that towards the end. Just so you know, the slides and the recording will be made available afterwards as sort of a follow-up item. So don't worry about that. I know we get a lot of questions on those over the sessions. And with that said, I will turn it over to Maria to get us going. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. I'm Maria Brown. I'm the Director of Supportive Housing Services with PATH. I've been with the organization, I just hit 8 years this year. And we really started developing this 4-step procedure, I want to say about 5 or 6 years ago, after we recognized that in collaboration with our property managers and on-site services, that we wanted to make sure philosophically we were on the same page with housing stability and really focusing on retention rather than a paper trail to eviction. So we developed this 4-step procedure, and we recently got it copyrighted last year, as Mark had mentioned. 3 years ago, I presented this over at the Housing First conference in Denver. And since then, we've done trainings with outside organizations. Our partners with Department of Health Services and Department of Mental Health have requested that we train to it, and they've incorporated components of it into their statement of work. So it's been a really successful model. So I'm happy to walk through this. If you want to go to the next slide. Next slide. So about PATH, we were founded in 1984, and we are the largest homeless nonprofit organization. And our mission is ending homelessness for individuals, families, and communities in California. Over the last 5 years, we've helped more than 10,000 people move into permanent homes, which is huge. Next. So about Path Ventures, that's the real estate development arm of PATH. We are a nonprofit and we're the PATH affiliate. We were founded in 2007, and we develop, operate, and affordable and supportive housing. We really want to put an emphasis on serving people moving out of homelessness. So before we go to the next slide, I'm going to have Jeanette pop up a quick poll because I want to know a little bit about you guys. If you could just answer a quick question. So the question is, what is your current role in housing? Affordable housing developer, permanent supportive housing developer, service provider, other. And Jeanette, let me know when those results are ready. Awesome. Okay. So it looks like 14% are affordable housing developer, 9% are permanent supportive housing developer. We have a lot of service providers, 41%, and several others. And then somebody wrote in the chat that they are both, which happens. Thank you. So next slide. So permanent supportive housing it's lease-based, right? So as long as the lease is being followed, housing is guaranteed. Services are also voluntary. So we can't say in order to live here, you have to participate in services. And then also the services are person-centered and tenant-driven. So we want to make sure that there's buy-in from the tenants and that they're the ones making the decisions on the terms of the services for their housing. Supportive housing really augments affordable rental homes. And overall, with this 4-step process, we've managed to maintain a 90% retention rate, which is amazing. Next slide. Our services approach, we work in collaboration with property management. So as you're going to see with this 4-step process, it's a collaborative effort. And we really want to use evidence-based practices, including harm reduction, to meet people where they're at. Next slide. And part of that is really recognizing the housing team and who comprises the housing team. So housing teams we're committed to the team approach. We work to make sure that we are prioritizing the tenant's housing retention. We want to establish a team process for problem solving and conflict resolution. And we want to make sure that we establish clear housing retention policies to work together and work to improve those policies and procedures. So this process has actually evolved over time as we've gotten feedback and looked at data through the years. Next slide. So part of that successful housing team is, just making sure that we have a commitment to a collaborative relationship with property management and services team. We want to make sure that the team works very closely together and that we have ongoing and regular communication. We meet weekly with our property managers formally. Informally, we're meeting daily. And it's really essential that everybody understands and respects the roles of each party. I always talk to our property managers, and as Mark mentioned, I've been in this field forever, about 20 years. So I've worked with some property managers for about that long. And I have one property manager, regional manager, he's like, I wish you would be my case manager if I ever needed something. And so we just really need to respect and understand each other's roles and responsibilities and trust the judgment. Next slide. So there's different roles and responsibilities. If I had a whiteboard behind me, I would do a Venn diagram. There is some overlap, but we also want to make sure that property management and services kind of like stick to their own roles and responsibilities. I'm not going to go through all of this. You guys will get copies of the slides. But property management, they're going to make sure that the physical maintenance of the property is taken care of. They're going to be collecting rent, enforcing the lease. That's huge. Supportive services, we're going to coordinate with the property manager on issues related to health and safety. We're going to work to create this housing retention plan. And we're really going to want to support problem solving and mediation attempts between the residents. We also do a lot of services programming to promote community building activities. Next slide. And then there's also going to be some shared responsibilities. So we're gonna both, orient and welcome new tenants, promote health and safety of the tenants. The example that I always give, sometimes maintenance requests, that might be a shared responsibility. Services might help the tenant complete the maintenance request while property management makes sure that that goes smoothly. So next slide. And we're all partners in housing retention, and that includes property management services and the tenant. We can't forget the tenant. Next slide. So this brings us to our four-step housing retention procedure. This was based in the idea of escalating responses to disruptive behaviors, which are going to happen in the field that we work in. Our tenants have a history of some significant barriers with mental health, substance use, history of homelessness. All of that is it's very trauma informed. And so we want to make sure that we want to escalate responses appropriately. And we want to capitalize on the strengths of each player of the housing team. And it's really important on quick response times. So you're going to see as I go through the process, response times are something that we highlight in each of the steps. So next slide. So we are starting at step one. And so we break this up in services and property management. I'm going to have Jeanette put a case study in the chat box. I'm going to read it real quick after I go through these steps. And then we're going to talk, as I go through each of the four steps, we're going to talk about what each of those steps would look like for this particular case study. So for step one, property management we created a universal referral form. So property management is going to complete that universal referral form and bring it to our weekly meeting. We have weekly meetings between property management and services. Within 72 hours of that notice violation, we're going to coordinate a meeting with the tenant, with services, and with property management. This is really key. And it's really imperative that we do it within the 72 hours. And I usually bring this back to like, if anybody has kids, you're going to want to make sure, that if a kid acts up at school, that you're addressing it pretty quickly. You can't bring it up 4 weeks later. Kid's not going to know what they're talking about. So the same philosophy goes. Like we want to make sure that we're addressing things within 72 hours. And as a housing team, we're going to verbally discuss it with the tenant. We're going to review with the tenant verbally the lease and show the rule that's being violated, while also tying in how that behavior that they're exhibiting is a lease infraction. We're going to ensure that the tenant understands the connection between the behavior and the lease infraction. And this is a proactive step that we developed. I think I had mentioned that this is a tool that really evolves over time. And this is kind of it's a proactive step because I recognized that sometimes our lease violations that we give our tenants are in legalese. They may not understand the lease in capacity. So we bring everybody together and we talk about it. So I've had that conversation with tenants, like, can you in your own words tell me what this lease violation means and what your behaviors that you're exhibiting are contributing to this lease violation? So that way we understand that the tenant understands. We're going to bring this item to the weekly meeting. The property manager is going to put it in their file. And then from the meeting, the property manager is going to issue a written memo. From the supportive services side, it follows along pretty closely with property management. So that universal referral form is discussed in the site meeting within 72 hours. And as the housing team, we're going to verbally discuss with the tenant. We're going to review the lease verbally, and we're going to make sure that the tenant understands. We're going to follow up with casual conversation one-on-one, and we're going to assess for ongoing challenges to following the rule. We're going to identify supports to meet the expectation and review house rules. So in the chat, I think I talked about a tenant, KS, who was a real tenant, who had some collecting issues. So if you guys can read along in the chat, I'm going to go through kind of quickly. But step one, what property management would do, maybe they saw that this tenant had some collecting issues when they went and did a regular housing inspection. So they're going to notify services with the universal referral form. Hey, we have some concerns. Within 72 hours of that, they're going to coordinate a meeting. We're going to bring in partners. We're going to talk to the tenant verbally. We're going to show them where it says in the lease, about maintaining a clean apartment, maintaining those clear entries and exits and windowsills. And then the services is going to follow up with casual conversation, one-on-one. We're also going to assess for ongoing challenges. Hoarding is in the DSM. So is it more clinical, or is it just that they're messy? So we need to, assess for any ongoing challenges, and identifying supports to meet the expectation and reviewing the house rules. So that's step one. Next slide. So step two is just an escalation of what has already happened. So a significant or reasonable amount of time has passed with no clear change or resolution. So this is going to lead to a clear lease violation. Step one was just a meeting with a memo following up. This is a clear lease violation. So property management, for the weekly meeting, they're going to update the universal referral form and bring it to our meeting. And they're going to issue a specific lease violation. So they're going to pull exactly from the lease where it says what the infraction was. And they're going to notify supportive services before that lease violation goes out, because we want to make sure that we're being proactive. Sometimes if a tenant gets a lease violation that service isn't unaware of, it could escalate to a situation. And we're going to bring it to a weekly meeting. Supportive services is going to review that universal referral form in the site meeting. We are going to make sure to meet with the tenant one-on-one and include any partners. That could be the VA, DMH, DHS. We're going to verbally create a housing retention plan. So we're going to talk to the tenant and really explore situational factors, assess barriers, identify any community resources, and connect the tenant to any necessary supports. So going back to what's in the chat box with our tenant who's a collector, property management is going to say, you know what, like we talked about this isn't getting any better. I have really big concerns. We are they're going to issue an actual lease violation, but they're going to not notify services first. And then we're all going to pull together, meet with the tenant one-on-one. We're going to include the partners. And we're going to talk to the tenant about any situational factors. So with collecting, I've had tenants where they're like, my mom passed away and gave me all of this stuff and I don't want to get rid of it. Okay, like let's talk about that. Do we need to get you a storage unit for those belongings? Like, is there a way that we could revamp your living area to where we can make room for it so it doesn't look as cluttered? Can we put in shelving or get you storage bins to help with that? We're also going to identify community resources. With this tenant, he was a senior, so we were able to connect him to, I believe it's called Genesis through DMH, and they have resources specific to collecting behaviors. And we're going to continue to connect to necessary supports to follow the lease. One thing that I always talk about in step two is, just making sure that services is notified before the lease violation goes out. I had a tenant who had been homeless for years, and he received a lease violation on his door, and he thought he was being evicted, and he ran away to the encampment that he used to live in. He thought he was being evicted. So we want to make sure that we're being proactive. Next slide. So step three, the tenant issue it continues to remain unresolved. There may have been some progress, but for the most part, like it's pretty status quo. So designated time period for correction has passed. And so we've got to move on to step three. So step three, we want to make sure that we're updating that universal referral form. And then we added a step to where the property manager, regional manager signs off in order to get to step three. So we want to make sure that the regional manager and director levels are reviewing everything that has been done prior to this before getting to step three. We're going to issue additional notice from the property management side, possibly a cure or quit. They're going to notify the Path Ventures team with a copy of the notice, and we're going to coordinate a meeting with the tenant and social services. So on the supportive services side, we're going to create a written housing retention plan. This is a formal document that we do. And remember at the beginning, I had said that everything is tenant driven and person centered. So we want to make sure that the tenant is really driving the outcomes of this. So I know sometimes property managers, I've heard them use language that this is a behavior contract, and I want to be very distinctive that this is not a behavior contract. A behavior contract is something that stipulates that a tenant has to do certain things in order to not lose their housing. This is tenant driven, it can evolve. So the example that I give, we had a tenant at one of our sites who they had gotten into a fight, and the tenant said, I'm going to go to anger management classes. They actually changed the behavior, but they didn't complete the anger management classes. But they never got into another fight. They just got zen by doing yoga and jogging. And so great. Property management was very concerned, and they brought it to our attention, and they were like, but they didn't do the anger management classes, so we need to move forward with eviction. So we had to have that conversation on the distinction between a behavior contract versus a person-centered housing retention plan. And in that housing retention plan, we're identifying 3 barriers and 3 support items to work on the resolution. And then we're having regular ongoing meetings. This is not something where you can say, okay, great, this is our plan. I'll check back with you in 6 weeks. This is something where you're going to have regular ongoing meetings. So with the person in the chat box, the collector, for the written housing retention plan, I believe it was something like, he will work with services 2 times a week to clear out 5 bags at a time and continue to work with the person from Genesis on the therapeutic component of that stuff. If he didn't do 5 bags that week, that's okay. Like, as long as there's progress, maybe he could only part with 1 bag. And that's what I'm saying, like, there's a level of flexibility with this form. And then we're setting regular meetings, and we really look to analyze that. So especially with like collectors, you can taper off. Like, so maybe you're meeting with them every week, then you taper down to every other week, then you taper down to every 2 weeks, and you're like, whoa, that didn't work. Like, things got bad again. So you got to go back up to every other week. So it's really flexible and meets the needs of the tenants. So next slide. And this is the final step, step 4. A reasonable time has passed, and the housing retention plan has evolved, it's changed, it's adapted, and there's just been no reasonable update to the concern. So at this point, I recognize, like, as much as I want to try to save everybody from a services provider's perspective, I recognize sometimes we can't. And so, we update the universal referral form. And then at this point, the partner and owner is sending it to eviction. When owners do that, they are not allowed to accept rent. And then Path Ventures is notified through a copy of the notice. From the supportive services side, especially because we're both owner and as well as partner in a lot of our properties, we have to take a step back in stopping our advocacy for the tenant at this point. So we can connect them to legal services, but we can't show up to court and say, yeah, I want this person to stay housed. Like, that's kind of where we make the break. So we're looking for community resources and supports to help somebody, legal supports if they want to dispute. We're exploring tenant rights housing options, as well as alternate housing. We never want to exit somebody into homelessness. So we try to see if somebody will relinquish their unit rather than getting evicted. So that way there's not an eviction on their record. And then we're like, maybe this isn't the right fit for you. Let's see if we can figure out a way to move you into alternate housing. So we can work with our partners on maybe a transfer or something like that. So with the case study, it actually got to this level. And I remember talking to our partner, and I felt awful, and I was like, we couldn't save him. There was nothing we could do. And we worked with DHS, and we had an outreach team following him, and we got him to where he was exited out of permanent housing, not into another permanent housing option, but at least he didn't go back to the streets. And step 4 is a last resort step. Next slide. Next slide. So some considerations for the future. Some people have been engaged in housing retention while getting active lease violations. Some people have declined housing retention efforts. Like, we talk to them, and like I said, it's person-centered. So I'll approach somebody and be like, hey, like, we want to help you retain your housing. And they're like, no, I'm not interested, thanks. And the door gets slammed in my face. That's okay. They are able to decline. There can be multiple violations occurring simultaneously, at which point we would do each violation as a separate process. So we could technically be in step 3 in one and step 1 in another. Also, we do not give notices on Friday after about noon, because staffing concerns. We don't want to trigger somebody to have an escalated situation happen over the weekend or holidays. So say like the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, we probably, knowing that it's going to be a 3 or 4 day weekend, we probably wouldn't issue any lease violations unless absolutely necessary. And then we would try to do it earlier in the week and make sure that we have a staffing pattern in place. Next slide. So we looked at some outcomes, and out of our unduplicated households, we had 19% participate in the housing retention, and this hasn't been updated since 2019. So I apologize. I'm 2 years past this. But of those who participated, 72% retained their housing. And of those who participated, only 6% went straight to level 4, and that was due to violence or safety concerns. Of all of those who went through the process and did not retain their housing, I reviewed each case personally to make sure that we were doing whatever it takes, in addition to utilizing any clinical resources. Our number one success is somebody who was part of the Hollywood Top 14. He was determined by professionals in the field. He's not a candidate for PSH. He is now, I need to update this, he's now been successfully housed for 4 years and is actually like a shining star at our Path Metro Villas 2 site. Doing so well, so stable, complete turnaround. I love going over to that site and visiting him. Next slide. Of the folks who exited, we noticed that common trends were either transitional age youth or collecting. And looking at that, I was able to strategically look at ways that our organization could better support those high barrier tenants. So we got our Train the Trainer and Buried in Treasure, which is an evidence-based practice in hoarding. We also really enhanced our motivational interviewing and seeking safety trainings, as well as ensuring cross-training property management with mental health first aid and nonviolent crisis intervention. So I'm actually a mental health first aid trainer, and part of my goals is to go to all of our properties and train all of our property managers so they understand the barriers of working with folks with experiencing mental health challenges. And then we also created the universal referral tool. Next slide. And that pretty much sums up everything. And now I'm going to pass it over to Kim. Thank you, guys.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Maria.
Maria.
Actually, I think Brett is going to start, but I'll just start by saying hello, everyone. I'm Kim Wee, Vice President of Residential Services with Century, and going to let Brett introduce himself and start with the first slide.
Thank you. Thank you, Kim. Hello, everyone. I'm Brett Morales. I'm the Vice President of Property Management for Century, and pleased to be here to see all you guys. So a little quick update about who Century is and our work. Century is a lending organization as well as a development company. We often lend to affordable housing developers looking to build affordable housing in throughout California, as a property management company, as well as a residential services organization who is represented here today with Kim and I. You can go to the next slide. So of course, we are a very mission-driven organization, as many nonprofits are, but we truly live our mission of financing, building, and operating exceptional affordable housing so that people we serve may have a dignified home, a healthy and hopeful future, and attaining economic independence. And we can go to the next slide. I think this is you, Kim.
Yeah, so as Brett said, we are a developer, and we have, Century does have many different affordable housing units, but the one that we are going to be talking about today is at Century Villages at Cabrillo, which was one of our largest supportive housing communities. So we're a 27-acre campus on the west side of Long Beach. We have at any given day about 1,500 residents on site. But what makes it unique is that we have about 15 service providers, partners on site that we work with. So in this case, we are taking everything that Maria just talked to you about and applying it across the entire community. So we have one property manager, that's Brett and his team, Century, but we have several different service providers that are working with different kinds of systems. And so Century Villages also we do have our own residential services team. And so we will be talking about that specifically, but Brett can share with you a little bit more about what it's like to work in a supportive housing community with a bunch of different providers and different systems. Next slide. Much like Maria said, we have the same kind of approach in that the resident is front and center. We work with the property management team. We have a resident services team, which is in our case, my Oasis team, but in other service providers, Path Ventures is one of them. And we have a community engagement team on site. So we work collaboratively to really what our goal is to help people remain stably housed. Next slide. Brett?
Okay, so this is important, understanding between residential services and property management and people in general, right? We all look through different lenses. We have different perspectives. We just see things differently. So for most of you, you might look at the top right-hand corner picture and see a duck. Others may see a rabbit. At the bottom, that picture could be a vase. And to some of you, it may look like two people facing each other. Who's right? Well, we may all be right, just looking at things differently. And this is no different with property managers and residential services. So I'd like to go ahead and it's wanted to caveat this conversation. So go ahead to the next slide. So although we may have a common goal, we have different ways of looking at things. Well, residential services, tends to focus on the resident and keeping them housed and just doing whatever it takes to keep them housed. Property management's focus is mainly on the community at large and making sure that that person integrates well and follows the rules of the lease agreement. Although this slide looks very simple, the work itself is certainly not. But it's worth the effort. There's lots of benefits that come along with this, right? It keeps everybody on the same page. This process also helps document all the work that goes into preserving that person's housing. Of course, there's also the humanitarian benefit that the person does retain their housing. But as a property manager, it's also good for business, right? I mean, vacancies and evictions cost money. And also this whole process, if at the end of the day it doesn't work, which it doesn't sometimes, you have this documentation to help you in court. So there's a little bit of that. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. I think this is you, Kim.
Yeah. So before I go through this slide, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on how we began using Path's four-step housing retention plan. So as I mentioned, we are a collaborative and we were holding monthly case manager roundtable meetings. And that's with myself, my team, and Path Ventures and other supportive services on site. And we were talking about how each of us have a different process for when a resident gets a lease violation. We have different ways, like Maria mentioned, there was behavioral contracts, there was housing retention plans, there was conversations with property, and we all seem to be doing it a little bit different, which I know was probably crazy making for property, first of all, because having to work with all of those different systems, but also as a collective, we felt like we on this campus should be working together to try to find the best practice. Well, it turned out at that point that we asked each of our partners to bring all of their forms and their processes to the roundtable. And honestly, at that point, it looked like Path had already done all the work. And we're like, can we just adopt and adapt the four-step plan, which is what we did with their permission. And so we did have to make a few tweaks because it is across many different service providers, but for the most part, we adopted it just like Maria explained. So we were really pleased to do that. And we put it in practice at the villages about the end of 2018. And so that's where our story started. We were already doing meetings. We were already having conversations. Obviously, there was issues and lease violations and all of these things happening prior to 2018. But what putting the four-step housing retention process in place did was make it clearer and it just made it a lot more black and white of how we should do that. And for property, and I'll let Brett jump in here if you wanted to talk a little bit about the background. For property, it made it one system instead of 10.
Mhm. Yeah, that's for sure. And I would also add that, the training and understanding of each other's roles and responsibilities is huge, right? We do a lot of additional training. My property managers and staff all get trained in mental health first aid and all kinds of other courses to help us understand our clientele better and understand the resident services and case managers language. And Kim's team, I know, also does kind of the same thing. They understand that we are bound by fair housing laws and tenant landlord laws, and so having that understanding of each other's point of view also is part of this is a huge part of this conversation.
Yeah. So even though we were doing meetings and we were doing having these conversations, simply putting this new process in place was not as simple as it sounds. We didn't just one day say, okay, we're going to start using this 4-step housing retention process. Brett and I were talking about, we had what we called clarity meetings, lots of them prior to putting this in place. And we were clarifying where we were at, where the challenges were, and how this 4-step housing retention process would really help. And how to do it is, I'm sure each agency may have a little bit different configuration, different forms, different ways, but for the most part, we slowly integrated it into our day-to-day operations. Prior to this, we had a lot of miscommunication and no clarity. We had meetings filled with people, service providers, volunteers, interns, property managers, way too many people in a room. And the communication was not good there. And so putting this into place with tools that are already set, with language that's set and followed in each and every resident case, helped clear up the communication. As Brett mentioned, there was a lot of training that happened prior to this and continues to happen. We had to rebuild trust. Some trust and communication really had broken down between services and property. We're unique in that we work for the same company. Brett and I have the same boss. We have the same mission, vision, and values. We have the same, we're in the same organization, but yet our roles are very different. And so there's going to be that natural tension no matter what. But putting this plan in place really helped with that. It gave us a shared language. Like Maria mentioned, there's steps. So instead of saying, well, they gotten so many lease violations, it's time to just send a covenant or quit. The question back can be, well, how many lease violations? What step are they on? Was it for the same behavior? And all of that really creates that clarity and collaboration. We don't leave those meetings without some understanding of where we're going next. So we weren't leaving the meeting stressed and not really understanding who was going to do what, when the lease violation was going to be posted, if there was a lease violation, what was next. Property wasn't wondering what services was going to do next. We all leave those meetings with a lot of clarity. I don't know, Brett, do you want to add anything else about this?
No, I think that you pretty much said it all. The trust was really important to know that everybody was really doing the best to preserve that person's housing. And you have to trust that everybody's doing whatever it is, whatever it takes. And so I think that was the only kind of addition I would add. Yeah.
And logistically, what we did was we cut down who was in those meetings.
Yeah.
Brett and myself were in each and every meeting and actually have been for the last 3 years. We rarely miss a meeting when we're not both there. And I would say we are there not to provide a lot of input, but we're there as support and coaching. In the beginning, we were a lot more involved than we are now. But we are always at those meetings so that if there's any conflict or question, we can be there to intervene.
Yeah.
We've taken the personal attacks out of it. It's really not. We don't get into the details in that sense where people were fighting back and forth on he said, she said. All of that's sort of gone now because it's black and white.
And even there was also times even when Kim and I disagreed on an action, and so having a final decision maker, in our case it's our executive director. If Kim and I can't come to an agreement either, we will bring it up to the next level, and having that final decision maker is really important.
Yeah. I think this is similar to what Maria was talking about, having a regional director review it. The difference is we're in that meeting, and so we're sort of reviewing it as we go. But we have a very small team, and that is my suggestion. It helps to not have too many voices in there. We were finding even case management staff was disagreeing with each other, property was disagreeing, and so a small team that can build that trust and really understand each other over time was for us the best practice in this case.
Yeah.
Next slide.
So I'm just going to say for our property managers out there, this process takes patience. You have to be able to be flexible and be able to work towards that common goal and trust each other that you're working hard to achieve the best outcomes. And you have to have commitment to the process. And just really understand each other's roles and really just no half measures. These are, for me, were the key aspects for implementing this program. And of course, expect to negotiate. That is probably the key thing. You have to be able to negotiate, and center your negotiations around finding solutions to the problem. If a conversation will do, you don't need to serve a cure or quit notice. Stay focused on solving the problem at hand, because oftentimes those conversations go into left field, but bring it back into the main problem. A big one is also avoiding the conjecture. Just work with the facts. It's so easy to get sidetracked and assume what is happening with an individual or a family when you don't have all the information. One example might be that somebody was acting erratically and was causing a nuisance to the community. Well, we have a conversation with Kim's team and case management, and they may say, well, oh, you know what, we found out he didn't have money for his medications, and that was why he had this behavior. Well, that changes the trajectory of things, right? It's not just somebody acting inappropriately. Or maybe it was that they were on the right medication, but were overtaking the medication. So anyway, I just want to make sure that you understand that negotiations are to be expected, and maybe sometimes heated, but try to keep the personal viewpoints out and just focus on the task at hand. I will say one last thing. You want to go to the next slide? We can. Oh, this is you, Kim. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. This, and I know it's a little bit hard to read, and we can send copies of this. This is what Maria was talking about in the referral form. And these are tools. These are tools that we didn't have in place a few years ago. And this is everything to us, because this referral form, it comes from property usually. Sometimes it goes the other direction. But when our managers, and it's not our entire staff, it's our resident services managers, receive the referral form from property, it has the details. It's date and times and what the infraction was or what the concern is. Sometimes it's an FYI. We receive that, and then we have an opportunity to review it with our case management staff, see if we have the information we need. And then everybody comes to the meetings, the property services meetings, with that information. And it's in black and white. It's a referral form that we can keep on, we can keep in a file, and that everybody knows the date it was received. The information is already on there. What was happening before a referral form like this is there was meetings in the hallway, because we're in the same organization and we see each other. We see each other at lunch. We see each other outside. And in passing by, somebody mentioned something. Oh, yes, I did that. Or I talked to the client and it's been handled. Or can you talk to the client about this? And those conversations were sometimes being forgotten or misconstrued. It was not being documented properly. And so when we would get back to the meeting, there would be a lot of, but I told you that, but no, you didn't. You didn't tell me, you told them, and they didn't tell me. And, our director of residential services and our property manager each had their own notebook. And those notebooks, I guarantee, did not match about what had happened.
For
But
sure.
this one referral form, this universal referral form, is a place where both parties document. And it's kept on file. It's updated with all the steps that happen along the way. And then when the behavior's been cured, we decide to close it because nothing's happened in 6 months and seems like the behavior's cured, we're going to close that one. Everybody signs the document, it's closed, it goes into the properties file, it goes into services file, and it's in black and white. And on the right side is a housing retention log that we use. It's just a Excel spreadsheet, but it keeps track of where everybody is in their steps, all the things that happen. And so I can quickly pull up where we're at with any resident. I can tell you how many were closed. I can tell you what step they're at and visually see that. This is a sample of that. But these kind of tools, plus shared minutes at every meeting, that has really helped with our clarity. Next slide.
Okay, this is me, right? Yeah. So, so before we had the four-step housing retention plan, when we first started, we set up this eviction criteria, and it was just basically questions we asked ourselves before we took somebody to eviction. And we have since adopted this plan and made step 16, which is, have we appropriately administered our four-step housing retention plan and has been successful. So that part has been added to this, but initially this was all we had that we worked off of, and we had to kind of ask these questions of ourselves. But now we kind of adopted this into the four-step housing retention plan, and this is it's actually it's a nice attachment. So if, for God forbid, you do have an eviction, having the four-step housing plan and this eviction criteria to present to the judge or jury at the whichever it is also beneficial to your management organization, because we know evictions are going to happen. The nice thing about the four-step housing plan and this eviction criteria is that you have some comfort in knowing that you and residential services has done everything they can to preserve that person's housing. It just didn't happen to work out in that particular instance, but it's really nice to have that feeling that you've done everything you could.
Yeah, agreed. And, I think we all agree that there are times when we just can't preserve somebody's housing for whatever reason. But the difference is really at this point, when we get to that point of step 3 or step 4, we're in agreement. We may not like it. As service providers, we always try to preserve housing to the end, but there are times when we just can't, and we are in agreement. So on the next slide, we'll tell you really what our outcomes are. And this is just for 2 of the buildings that my team is the case management for. We have 200 permanent supportive housing households that was represented. Out of those 200 households, we had 132 referrals, which actually is about only, there's multiple referrals for the same household. So it represented about 40% of our households only. So like Maria said, one household could have multiple referrals going at any time, but they can close and they can continue, and they don't just accumulate on top of each other. Out of those 132 referrals, and this was from about November 2018 to present, 120 of them were closed or cured, and leaving about 94% retention ratio. We have a few that are still open, and we had 5 evictions. And in a couple of those evictions, they moved directly to step 3 or 4. And in those cases, that's sort of the gray area about what's reasonable behavior and which ones you can actually use this process for. In some fire, life, and safety, that's the caveat, it could jump directly to a quit notice. And in, I believe, one case, because there was an act of violence on site, that one moved directly. The rest of them had gone through their steps. Next slide. And this final slide is just to show you our global outcomes. We do an annual social impact report for the villages at Cabrillo, and we collect our housing retention across all of our partners. So this would include all of our permanent supportive housing residents on site. And we are really pleased that we have a 96% housing stability rate for after a year. And really having processes like the 4-step housing retention process and working really closely with our service providers and property management is really the reason we're able to have such a great number in that area. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kim and Brett. We do want to entertain some questions. We've got some questions that have come in online. So I'll start with, and thank you, Maria, for handling that one question on the chat. First things first, Kim, if folks want to refer folks over to Century Villages, how would they do that? That seems like a fairly straightforward one now.
There's a couple of ways depending on the client. Obviously, we have, I know this is to you, Kim, but I'll answer it. We go through the local CES, the housing authority. So there are, depending on the client, if it is a veteran, they go through our US Vets group. So it depends on the building. We also provide housing, emergency shelters, transitional or bridge housing. So it really depends. But you can certainly call our office, the property office, and they'll help to direct them.
Anyway, maybe to Brett to put that in the chat if possible.
Sure.
What that number would be, or a way to connect.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay. Maybe to Maria, Kim, and Brett, welcome to this one too. Just, Maria, you mentioned at the outset that you're talking about, this collaboration with property management. Obviously, there's information being shared. How do you maintain that privacy with property management, and how do you navigate that?
That's a good question. We actually have a release of information form, and we streamlined it where it checks the box off of which property it is, and then you can check each box on who we're sharing information with. And every tenant does it annually with their annual paperwork, and we always check property management. So that way we can have that flow of information between property management and services. We notify the tenant when they're signing that form that, because it is a partnership, we do check that box with property management. If for some reason, I don't think they've ever told us not to, then we would not check it. And we update that annually, and we give our property managers copies of it.
Okay. How about if an incident comes back 6 or 12 months later? How do you guys handle that? How does that relate to the steps?
Yeah, I think this one's really important, and I'm sure Maria would agree that, and this is one of the ones that was presenting some issues prior to this, and that if the behavior had been cured after 6 months, we close that case. And 6 months seems to be about the number. I mean, there are extenuating circumstances where we might go a little bit longer. We close that referral, and it should start back at step 1, even if it's the same behavior. And I know that sometimes this is the crazy making part for property, is that there would be several different infractions happening at the same time at different steps, but it doesn't mean that they all combine together and move up a step. They're considered each individual behavior, because frankly, the intervention is very different for each of those behaviors too. And the time, one of them might be simply just having a conversation and it would be cured. Others may, if it's something like a hoarding disorder, it may take months and months of working with a service provider.
As long as we're seeing some progress being made. And it's also important to know that we have implemented a bit of a difference in that, depending on how the severity of the incident, we may have to skip a step because it's fire life safety issue that this person is. So we may have to jump a couple of steps for that purpose.
And Brett, say there was an eviction ultimately for something that was violent or a safety issue, would they be able to reapply to that program?
Sorry, to our property, no. After they've been evicted from Century or any of Century's properties, we would not allow them back here.
Okay.
We do accept people that have had evictions in the past, but once you've been evicted from us, we do not accept anymore.
Okay. Question for the group too. Obviously these days we're doing a lot of deals that have mixed units, PSH and affordable. Does this model differ in terms of how it's applied when you've got sort of a mixed population building or mixed income?
Start. We have a lot of mixed population buildings with fair housing and just the path model in general. We apply the same services interventions to every household. We don't necessarily differentiate and say you're in a PSH unit, so we're going to support you, but we're not going to support somebody else. That said, some of the units in the affordable units, some of the folks in the affordable units may not have that level of connection with the services team on site, so they may be hesitant to our outreach attempts if it gets that way. So, some of our properties, the affordable units have a great relationship with the services team, and that's just how it's been. But then some of our other communities, they're just like, yeah, I don't really need you, I'm cool. So it really, but we're going to offer that retention process to every household.
Yeah, I would say that it's the same for us, and the level of need would depend on if they're an intensive case management client. There may be different people that are involved in that, but ultimately it's the same process for anybody.
Yeah. And I think that's even being underscored in how funders are approaching this too. They really want to see that equitability in terms of how you're approaching those populations, in terms of what you're offering. There was a question on eviction fees and how that's who's really compensated for that, if possible. Will the landlord be responsible? Rosanelli's asking, will the landlord be responsible for the legal eviction fees, or will they receive some compensation from PATH? So maybe Maria, any thoughts on that?
That's a PATH question. I don't really see that side of things. The financial, I think we just take it as a financial hit, if I'm correct. And we just understand that, I want to say anytime something goes to eviction, it's going to be what, 8,000 to 10,000 minimum. With COVID, there haven't been any evictions in the last year or so. So that's why, in addition, I think Mark and Brett and Kim were talking about this a little bit, like, in addition to, just wanting to retain people's housing, you also have to look at it from the business perspective and financial impact. So we're going to want to retain housing because we're not going to want to have to turn over that unit. We're not going to want to have to pay those eviction costs. But at the end of the day, I think it is something that the property absorbs.
That's helpful. From a fair housing standpoint, say somebody doesn't want to participate in the 4-step kind of process, how does that get treated?
Well, all services are voluntary for our residents. So we offer it to them. We offer what our services are, the advocacy that we could work with them. But if they choose not to work with us, then that's up to them.
Okay. I think that's most of what's in here on the questions, guys. Am I missing anything? Have you had situations where guests are the issue?
Certainly.
Don is asking.
All the time.
I think you can imagine.
Always.
Always.
That may be a #1 issue actually right now.
Yeah. I mean, of course, that's one of the bigger issues. We really try to work with all the residents about how long they have guests for and their guest behavior, because ultimately the residents are responsible for their guest behavior. But sometimes those guests visit multiple homes within our community, so it can cross over from Anchor Place to Gateway to any of our buildings here. So you might have a guest that happens to stay in different people's homes and cause problems.
Sure. Okay. What kind of approaches have been successful to assist with housing retention and substance abuse? Maybe a final question there.
We have partnerships because most of our funding does come through DMH and DHS. We have access to the Department of Public Health on-site sends workers. So we really try to use those interventions, as well as I have some staff on my team that have like their KDAC certifications and that kind of stuff. We recognize substance use is going to be a barrier. And what we work to do, and I understand it's in the federal funding guidelines that like it's zero tolerance, but we are housing first and we are harm reduction. And so we focus on the behavior. So the example that I gave last week on a call, I was like, if somebody's using meth and the way that they cope with that meth use is to clean their apartment and they're not bothering anybody, cool, none the wiser, right? But if somebody is smoking meth and running around the building naked, we're going to address the running around the naked. In addition, it's going to be the meth use that probably led to that, but we want to focus on that actual behavior, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Okay. We will leave it there, guys. I want to thank our panelists, Maria, Kim, and Brett, and thank you, Jeanette, for obviously organizing this and hosting us, and for you all out there in the field. participating in this session and offering those great questions and just staying engaged for the full hour. Really appreciate it. Stay tuned for some of the follow-up with the slides and the recording, and we will work on trying to get those forms out if we can too, okay? So thank you and goodbye.